The fleet was starting to slow down, and as it did so, it began to wake up. Fleet? Perhaps not the best way to describe it. A fleet implies ships. You could be forgiven for mistaking them for spaceships, but the members of the fleet would describe themselves as more like a pod of whales. Or at least, they would if they had any idea what a whale was. They would still be wrong anyway, although they wouldn't know why. Not only do they not understand what a whale is, they don't understand themselves very well either. But it's a close enough analogy for now. The ships, whales. Individuals that made up the pod had turned their engines towards the larger of the two stars in the binary system, and were currently braking to bring themselves into relativistic parity with the rest of the objects there. Planets, asteroids, and so on. This was a subconscious process, automatically started near the end of their journey in the same way seeds put out shoots after the first thaw of spring. But as they got closer to the main sequence star, and the temperature crept just a few degrees above the absolute cold of space, more and more consciousness began to return. Well, in 14 of the 15 individuals that made up the pod. The journey had been a long one, and the more time you spend in the void, the more you expose yourself to its dangers. In this case, the 15th individual had been hit by a micrometeoroid large enough to punch through the thick metallic skin and scramble the much softer parts contained within. Or at least, those bits relevant to consciousness. It was already well ahead of the rest of the pod, and as its companions began to awake, the first thing they registered was that its engines had failed to ignite. They called out to it, searching across the spectra for a signal it could hear. But no, nothing but silence. Death was not unknown to the pod. It was rare. Each individual was a metal-encased, tapered wedge over a kilometre long, so there wasn't much that could hurt them. But on a long enough timescale, even something as unlikely as running into a lump of matter in the middle of the void becomes possible. Each of them knew this. Yet still, it was a shock. There were many objects in the universe, but only 14 other individuals. It was a small number, and it had just been reduced by one. Worse still, it was one of the elders of the group. The pod had no way of marking objective time, at least consciously. They kept track of the past by saying how many stops back in their constant wandering an event had taken place. But each knew its place in the birth order, and there were only 2 individuals who preceded the deceased. For most of the pod, they had just lost someone they had known since the beginning of their existence. So when the braking finally brought them into a stable orbit around the main star, before they did anything else, they mourned. This started with sharing their favourite memory of their lost companion. Over such a long life, there were many to choose from. Then, one by one, they aimed the laser mounted on their nose towards, but not quite at, their departed friend, and performed a final salute. On very low power, of course. Their energy reserves were low after their long journey, and although the sun was starting to replenish them a little, they would need everything they had left for what came next. Engines burning on low, blue flames, they reoriented themselves and started heading towards the nearest comets. The system had several relatively dense asteroid belts, which was one of the reasons they'd chosen it as their destination. In some places, the small lumps of rock and ice were only a few tens of thousands of kilometres apart. The ice was what they were interested in at the moment, and they approached a comet a few hundred metres across. Then they fired their lasers at it. They melted the ice slowly and carefully, because they didn't want escaping steam scattering the globs of liquid. Once they had enough, each of them extended their collection funnel, whole plates peeling back away from their nose, maybe for a fifth along their body length, until where before there had been a spike, there was now an enormous inverted cone. Then, by the simple expedient of propelling themselves through the globules of liquid water, they began to drink. They repeated this with 2 more comets, and then they rested for a moment. They were carrying a lot of extra weight now, and they needed time for it to settle. They used this time to do detailed scans of the asteroids near them. They had detected several with roughly the mineral balance they needed. There was a bit of a debate on which to head for, the closest or the richest. As usual, a compromise was found, and they decided on the third best mineral composition, which was the fourth closest. When the water was evenly distributed internally, their engines lit up again. Unhurriedly, the kilometre-long darts coasted towards their target, an oblate spheroid of rock roughly 5 times their length. Its composition was mainly nickel and iron, but with high amounts of lithium, carbon, silicon, sodium, lanthanides, and various other trace elements. The pod did not know these specifics, of course. They just knew that it looked rich. They braked using their manoeuvring thrusters rather than going to the trouble of flipping themselves over. It was gentler too. Then their catapults extended from hatches roughly halfway along their hulls. At some point when they were young, each member of the pod inevitably asked why they couldn't use their lasers to break up asteroids. For most members of the pod, it would be so long since they heard the question that they would have forgotten the answer and just tell their junior companion that it was how things were done. However, with enough pestering, eventually one would remember. The rock needed to be pulverized to a fine dust in order for them to consume it, but if they tried doing that with a laser, they would just scatter it all over the solar system. But now that they had water, they could use that with the reserves of material they collected in the last system to make a liquid that would dissolve the rock on contact. That was why they had to be careful to be out of each other's way when they shot their catapults. The corrosive liquid could damage even their thick, durable skin. They pelted the asteroid with acid, each droplet several thousand litres. Whatever they did to it internally to make it so corrosive, and they had no idea what that was, also made it very viscous, so that it stuck to the asteroid rather than splashing off. At least, not before they were ready for it to. Every so often they warmed the acid with their lasers to stop it from freezing solid, and they continued the bombardment until the whole surface was covered. Sometimes they had to visit several asteroids before they collected enough material, but this one was large enough and rich enough that by the time it was half dissolved, they felt they should have what they needed. The next bit required a certain amount of precision, so it was the eldest among them, who no others remembered a time without, who went first. It shot an extra fast droplet into the asteroid, with enough force that it looked like it should burst the whole wobbling, jelly-like mess apart like a supernova. Instead, it hit just hard enough to cleave off a chunk intact. Then, at much lower power, the elder shot a droplet of a substance they understood would make the corrosive liquid neutral again. Essentially, it was now a big, juicy ball of water, in which were dissolved all the rich minerals that they needed. The eldest was the first one to open up their scoop again and feast, followed by the others according to the birth order. A few more shots were required to break off the rest of the consumable material. To give them practice, younger individuals were then allowed to try, with mixed success. Now they were sated. Well, almost. All their water and mineral reserves had been replenished, but they were still very low on energy after their long voyage. They put a little distance between themselves and the half-melted asteroid, and then they began to extend their solar panels. First, the spines extended perpendicular to their bodies, from a ring just forward of the engine section. Then, the gossamer fine fabric of the panels began to unfurl, like a frill around their necks, silvery gold, and shimmering against the pitch-black void. At full extension, the energy collectors had a radius 3 times the length of their bodies. In fact, they were so large that they actually provided enough thrust to give them a small but noticeable acceleration. They could travel the stars by sail alone, if they were prepared for it to take 1,000 times longer. At this distance from the Sun, their energy was relatively weak, and it would take a long time to fully restock their reserves. However, they didn't plan to leave the binary star system just yet. They had only just got here, after all. Fully recharging could wait until they were getting ready to leave on the next leg of their nomad lives. First, they were going to explore. There was, as usual, some debate over what was interesting enough to be worth taking a closer look at. Several individuals wanted to head over to the largest gas giant. Navigating through the strong and complex gravity eddies created by the interactions between the planet and its moons would be exhilarating. The eldest was against this. One who had come before even they themselves had been lost this way. Two other elders who remembered this also voiced concerns, although they also said that if they maintained a reasonable distance, the risk should be extremely negligible. But at some point, they would have to do the tedious chore of mapping the other asteroids for important trace elements, so they might as well start with that. However, several of the younger individuals kept pushing for the gas giant. In the end, a compromise was reached. They would investigate the fourth planet from the Sun, a rocky planet rather than a gas giant, but it was large enough that it had its own atmosphere. Scans from a distance showed that its composition was consistent with the presence of some forms of life. Some of the very youngest had never seen other life before. The potential was enough for them to forget about the gas giant for the moment. They were retracting their solar panels and just about to head towards the planet when suddenly they felt a change come over them. Yes, this. They never discussed this, never planned this, but somehow at every system they came to, every time they finished replenishing themselves, they felt compelled to do this. The moment the solar panels locked closed again, each individual was hit by a wave of pleasure so intense that for a moment they were all but unconscious. As they came to, they found that a funnel, much smaller than the main scoop on their nose, had unfolded from roughly a third of the way along from their engines. One by one, each individual turned their catapults towards the other members of the pod, and one by one, they shot a small globule of liquid, encysted in a white reflective film, at low speed. There was a sense of release and relief with every bit of liquid they shot, and every time they intercepted a globule, they were hit by another wave of pleasure, shivering from bow to stern. For a while, they drifted in a daze. Then they started to come to their senses again. They did not discuss this. They enjoyed it, certainly. They enjoyed it a lot. But the feeling that they weren't entirely in control of themselves made them uncomfortable. When discussion started again, it was all concerning the planet they had decided on. Almost without thinking about it, they vented the waste material left over from the asteroid, ejected from ports by their engines in large plumes of sludgy liquid that quickly froze in the vacuum. Some of them melted again, for a moment, as they were caught in the brilliance of the engine burn, but then the cold enveloped them. The pod sped away, leaving a cloud of darkly glinting crystals behind them. It was a fairly brief jaunt from the asteroid belt over to the fourth planet. When they arrived in orbit, the pod spread out and started to look around. Their sensors and scanners could operate over millions of kilometers, so surveying a rock only a few hundred kilometers below them wasn't much of a challenge. Quickly, they began to find points of interest. For example, there were agglomerations of twisted metal that looked more like their own skins than natural outcroppings. According to the eldest, this probably wasn't evidence of life. Life, as it occurred on rocky planets at least, was usually accompanied by a green fur across large parts of the planet, or something similar. But across all the continents, there was nothing but bare rock and dust. If those piles of twisted metal had once been life, they had most likely been from another pod like theirs. Individuals who had strayed too close to the planet's gravity well, for some reason, and not been able to escape. A sobering thought. There were many dangers in space, but the idea of falling, snared by gravity, and unable to escape, with nothing they could do but consider the inevitable impact that awaited. That was a horror they all feared. Then, one of the younger ones spotted something. Something moving. Quickly, All the rest of the pod swung around like needles pointing to magnetic north, and jetted over to have a look. What they found was, in a word, curious. At first they couldn't even work out what they were looking at. A sphere, a metal sphere 200 meters across, held up on 8 legs that rose and fell with arthritic jerks that just about provided forward motion. It stomped along a dusty plain almost 3,000 kilometers wide, and from the tracks snaky around the continent, it had been doing it for quite a while. From the hollowed-out husks of metal scattered across the plain, it had had more company once upon a time. Some remains had the right geometry that they could be siblings of the wandering orb, and others close cousins. There were ovals and oblongs, and a set of smaller connected spheres that the pod would have compared to a caterpillar, if they'd had any idea what a caterpillar was. There were also more arcane shapes, although it was hard to tell if these were the remains of something larger that, millennia by millennia, had been whittled down by the grit-studded winds. Some looked so embedded in the surface that it was hard to see how they had ever moved, although again, it could just be that the loose sand had piled up around them and been compacted into something approaching rock. They certainly looked like they'd been there long enough. Maybe they were the remnants of individuals like the pod, who had impacted at high speed, or perhaps they had been sedentary denizens of this dusty rock for the whole course of their lives, whatever those have been, however long ago. All that could be said for sure was that once there had been many things here, and now there was only one. The pod watched the sphere trundling along the expanse for a while. To individuals who were able to travel millions of kilometers for a short jaunt, it was agonizingly slow. Still, there was something admirable about its persistence. Wherever the bulbous thing was going, it was certainly determined to get there, although whether it would or not was an open question. Its skin was stained with streaks of corrosion and starting to flake away. In some places there were already small holes in its metal casing. But as they watched, it stopped and retracted one of its legs into its body. When the leg extended again, the corrosion had been wiped away, and a shiny new coating applied in its place. However decrepit it was, it clearly wasn't ready to give up yet. On and on it dragged itself, heading towards no particular goal that they could see. Then the sphere stopped again. This time a hatch in its underside opened, and a screw extended down, punching into the ground. Churn, churn, churn. The sand and rock was drawn up into its body, and a big cloud of dust started billowing out from waste pipes on top. After a while it stopped, retracted its drill, and started stomping along in a new direction. This prompted an argument amongst the pod. Having shown no signs of life other than the ability to walk, it had now done something not so very unlike what the pod had done with the asteroids. Could it be more interesting than it first appeared? Could it be an individual with consciousness? The pod bombarded it with signals from across the spectrum, but there was no response. Was it devoid of intellect, or could it just not hear them? Some thought that they should keep trying. Others thought that the ability to consume was no indication that there were any higher functions. Not everyone found this debate particularly interesting. After a while, one of the younger individuals extended his catapults and threw a rock at the sphere. Well, just a small clump of waste minerals, and not actually at the sphere, just close enough to elicit a reaction. The projectile thudded into the plane a few hundred meters away from the sphere, sending shockwaves through the ground and air, and a plume of debris up into the sky. The sphere didn't react. Its legs continued to rise, rotate, and stamp back down again without missing a beat. The elder individuals admonished the rock thrower. It might have been taken for an attack, and they didn't know whether the sphere was capable of retaliating. However, no harm done. It seemed that the sphere wasn't aware after all. The other individuals of the pod started taking pot shots at the planet as well, aiming closer and closer to the sphere to try and provoke a response. Still nothing. One of the pod tried making a crater in the sphere's path. The sphere stopped at the edge, walked around it, and continued on its way. Another one tried the same thing, and the sphere once again just walked around. At no point did it show any signs that it might fear damage from the impacts, or even notice them apart from the obstacles they caused. It just doggedly trudged along. Then one of the individuals, getting bored, aimed a large clump of matter right next to the sphere. The missile screamed down through the atmosphere, red hot, and slammed into the ground close enough to blast several more panels away from the sphere's outer hull. The sphere was in the middle of a step, but when its leg came down, it came down on loose and broken rock. The rest of the pod scolded the reckless individual. Even with their precise senses, the shock could easily have gone wide and vaporized the sphere. And then what would they have amused themselves with? They were about to forgive the now contrite individual, no harm done, when the ground gave out beneath the sphere's leg. As rock crumbled away, two more legs found themselves standing on nothing but thin air. The sphere teetered and scrabbled in its agonizingly slow way as its legs tried to find stable ground. Then it started to tip. It was almost serene, the way it keeled over, and slid down the still smouldering bowl of the crater, carving a furrow in the loose scree. The cloud of dust thrown up shrouded it for a moment, and the pod waited, anxiously, to see what had become of the curiosity that had caught their interest. Gradually, the winds carried away the dust. The sphere was on its side, intact, but it would be walking nowhere anymore. A shame. It would have been interesting to see what else it could learn from it, but it clearly was of no use to anyone now. And yet, its legs were still moving. The sphere was still struggling to right itself, kicking against the ground, but mostly grasping only empty air. A few of the pod debated trying to blast a new crater beside it to tip it upright again, but that seemed likely to destroy it altogether. In any case, they had more or less lost interest now. The rocky planet had proved an interesting diversion, but it was time to go and have a look at the gas giant now. However, one of them spotted that from this angle it was possible to see inside the sphere, especially now that more of the hull plates were missing. It refocused, refining its scanners and its receivers to pick out the finest details. At first it saw nothing but a jumble of conduits not unlike what had been visible in the exposed wreckage scattered across the continent. Then it saw something interesting. Glass tubes, maybe 2-3 meters long, filled with liquid. Curious in itself, but it was what was in these tanks that was really interesting. Whatever they were, they didn't look metallic. They looked sort of squishy. 4 appendages coming off a central trunk, and a round lump on top. The individual could see that there were tubes connecting each occupant to its tank, perhaps therefore to the rest of the sphere. Every so often the things in the tanks jerked, spasmodically, without any indication of intent, but there was movement that was more than just the plodding mechanical process. Were these a type of organ, helping to process consumed material in some way, or regulating some other function? They definitely seemed to be integrated into the sphere's internal structure. They must serve a purpose of some kind. The individual called the rest of the pod's attention to the tanks. The other individuals, who had just been about to head off, cast a cursory glance back down at the planet. Then they took a closer look. The younger individuals started to chatter excitedly. This was new. This was interesting. This was something worth investigating. They debated whether to try throwing more stuff at it. They debated whether to poke it with a laser, on very low power, to see if there was a reaction. The eldest 4, however, had a very different, private conversation. The 4 who were old enough to remember an individual who had come before them, who had been killed in an unexpected meteor shower, and also remembered what they had seen when they investigated the shattered remains of their former companion. Suddenly they announced that there would be no more time wasted on the rocky planet. They had learned all they were going to learn from the 8-legged sphere. It was time to leave it alone and go on to the gas giant. A few of the others protested, wanting to investigate this new discovery further, but the 4 elders were unusually insistent. Those who didn't really care sided with them immediately, and a few more were swayed, until the holdouts had no choice but to concede. The 14 darts swung themselves around, and with the flare of their engines broke orbit, kilometre-long forms receding from the planet until they were merely specks in the sky, and then not even that. There was some grumbling during the short journey, but once they got to the gas giant, the younger ones quickly forgot all about the sphere, and what was inside the sphere. The eldest 4, on the other hand, lingered on it for quite some time. They couldn't explain, even in the privacy of their own minds, exactly why the sight of those tanks and their contents had made them so uncomfortable. Maybe because they had entered something that, if not quite like them, was at least similar, or had been once. Or maybe it was because there are some questions that should not be delved into too deeply, especially questions about oneself. However, even the elders eventually became so wrapped up in the interesting things elsewhere in the system that they stopped thinking much about the sphere. It was not in their nature to dwell on the past. Instinctively, they always looked forward to the next leg of their long, long journey. The pod bounced around the binary star system for a while, visiting the gas giants, taking a look at a few interesting dwarf planets caught between the main sequence star and its white dwarf partner, then returning to the asteroid belt to catalogue them in detail and extract a few more trace elements they would need. Then they headed deep into the inner system, almost touching the corona of the star, and unfurled their solar panels again. There was nothing interesting left to see here now. Soon they would start the next stage of their cosmic journey, and settle down into a sleep of eons. But first, they would bask, drinking in the sun's rays until they were not just sated, but absolutely saturated with energy. Only once they were done could they accelerate to interstellar speeds again. They would leave almost as soon as they were finished. Almost, but not quite. First, they would retreat a little, heading back to cooler climes where they weren't blasted with radiation. Then a hatch would open on the underside of one of the pod, and a new individual would emerge. Only 100 meters long, but once they got to the next system and started to consume more asteroids, it would start to expand until it was the same size as the rest of the pod. Until then, however, its small size would be an asset. Much less mass to accelerate. It would make the interstellar journey easier than most of them. They all remembered what it was like to be so agile and so young, curious about everything. They didn't know how this happened or why. They didn't even know which of the pod would be the one to bring forth this new companion, although it tended to be one who hadn't done it recently. There might even be 2. The elders said it was more likely for multiple individuals to bring forth new life when one of the pod had been lost recently, which suggested some kind of intentional process rather than a random event. But again, when it came to their own internal workings, they were somewhat squeamish, losing their natural curiosity. But all that was a surprise waiting for them in the future, where surprises always waited. For now, the pod was content to sit and bask. They never returned to the 4th planet to see how the sphere was faring. Perhaps it had righted itself and continued stomping along its circuit round the dull and dusty wastes for whatever inscrutable purpose. Or perhaps it had finally accepted the end and reclined into a final, permanent sleep like all the companions it once shared its journey with. Perhaps that might even be for the best. Certainly, none of the pod could imagine enduring their long journey alone. They would leave without knowing any more about it. Perhaps that was for the best as well.